Perfect, Tom. That's much better.
Okay, sorry, thanks.
Seeing more of your head and shoulders, yeah.
So I think we're live now. Hello, everyone. This is the Middle East Institute's Frontier Europe initiative in Washington, D.C. My name is Yulia Joja. I'm a senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute looking at Black Sea security. And this webinar is part of a series hosted by Frontier Europe. For more information on our program, just have a look on our website and on our Twitter website. It's at MEI Frontier. And also a quick shout out to our participants. If you have any questions during our conversation, please use the Q&A function in your Zoom app and write us your questions. We will try to address as many of them as possible in our conversation today of an hour. And with that, I would like to go to our panelists today. I am joined today by two people who I continue to learn most from on Black Sea studies. We have today with us Steve Flanagan, senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, who's done amazing work on the Black Sea for many years and has in the near future, RAND report on the Black Sea security coming out, so look out for that. And our second panelist today in a conversation is Thomas Durrell Young, who's a senior lecturer at the Institute for Security Governance, U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, and is the editor-in-chief of Journal of Defense and Security Analysis, where they also look a lot on Eastern Europe. And Tom has also been a long time participant in Black Sea security with his extensive work on post-communist modernization of countries in terms of the military. If you're interested in that topic, check out his fabulous book, Anatomy of Post-Communist European Defense Institutions. And welcome, everybody. Just a quick introduction into our discussion today. We will be talking about Black Sea security and strategic adaptation of NATO member states and NATO partners in the region in the context of new security challenges over the last years posed mainly by Russia after the invasion in 2008, and particularly after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, when countries in the Black Sea region and generally NATO has been starting to adapt from a focus on expeditionary warfare back to territorial defense. But this process is full of obstacles on several sides and is a hard and long process. So we want to take the advantage of today's discussion to talk about some of these challenges that countries in the Black Sea are facing, trying to strategically adapt to new security challenges and threats in the region. So let's start the conversation with Steve. Welcome. We want to, before we talk about each of the countries and how the region is adapting, I think we need to start with Russia in the Black Sea. The challenges that it represents in concrete terms, and why the Black Sea, despite these challenges and the volatile security situation in the region over the last few years, why this region continues to be, to a certain extent at least, neglected by US policymakers. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yulia, and thank all of your colleagues for organizing this event and for the nice introduction. So I'll get right to it. I'm going to talk about two strands of research that we've been pursuing at RAND on Black Sea security. First of all is Russia's overall strategy and regional goals, employing a variety of non-military and military instruments to advance its interests. And then we've been looking at how the 3 NATO allies and the 5 partners, and I'll enumerate them later, in the region perceive and are responding to Russia's activities and where their interests align and diverge, as an effort to identify possible elements of a more coherent, countervailing Western and NATO strategy to protect mutual interests, and what each country might contribute to supporting that strategy. And Dr. Young's comments will talk a lot, I'm sure, about that issue of the contribution. So I'll just touch on them briefly. So what I want to talk mostly today is that latter strand of research, which is the subject of a workshop last year with experts, including Yulia and former officials from the region that discussed, and it was discussed in a report that my colleague Irina Chendea and I wrote last fall that was on the RAND website. But let me turn to Russia, as Yulia suggested. In a sense, what is the challenge that we think that allies and partners need to respond more effectively to? Well, first of all, the Black Sea region is, in our assessment, the central locus of the competition between Russia and the West for the future of Europe. The region has experienced 2 decades of simmering conflicts, of course, even before Moscow's illegal annexation of Crimea and the initiation of the insurgency in the Donbass. And Russia has used military force against countries in the region several times since 2008. The Kremlin seeks to establish a sphere of privileged influence in the region through the use of informational, diplomatic, economic, energy, clandestine, and military instruments. And it uses these tools to foster divisions among NATO allies and to thwart the integration of partner countries into the Euro-Atlantic structures. We were particularly been struck by, in our research, how Russia has been using hybrid tactics. There's been a lot of discussion of the use of the hybrid threat in the Baltics and Northeastern Europe. But we found also in the region a great deal of concern among all the countries, including some of the most able to deal with these tactics, that Russia's use of hybrid tactics, which is a preferred mode using intelligence, special forces, military personnel, and private contractors and other things, those have all been used in irregular warfare in Ukraine, but also other kinds of informational activities. And of course, underlying all of this, though, is the conventional military capabilities that provide the essential underpinnings for achieving Russia's military regional goals. And Russia's military buildup in Crimea, its modernization of the Black Sea Fleet and the Caspian Flotilla, the increases in ground forces in the Southern Military District are all designed to secure Russia's vital southwestern flank from attack, to dissuade and intimidate neighbors, and to support wider power projection, including beyond the Black Sea region. So given this situation, as Yulia alluded to earlier, we come to the conclusion that security in the Black Sea region has not received the attention and commitment from NATO and other European governments that it warrants. So we turned then to the question of, well, I think if many observers who've looked at this agree that if we don't have a coherent strategy, a coherent Western US/allied strategy, why is that and what are the challenges? So we looked at the question of how did our 3 allies, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, first of all, look at the region and Russian response and Russian activities, and what are their inclinations with regard to a response? Well, we found that the 3 allies have overlapping and divergent views of Russia. Romania is probably the most wary of the Russian military activities and is the most capable in resisting malign influence, but it is still quite concerned about hybrid threats and efforts to try to sow divisions within the country. Bulgaria, while committed to Western integration, is a bit more subject to Russian influence and economic pressure, and its government has often been balancing relations between Moscow and the West. Turkey, which has been indeed a difficult ally and sometimes often very much balancing relations between Russia and the West, nonetheless still values the NATO security guarantee, but is also willing to impede allied initiatives, as was in the news even just in the last few days again, and I'll touch on that later. So the Romanians have advocated an expanded US and NATO military presence and civilian activities in the region. They host some of the existing NATO so-called tailored presence in Romania and have been very active in that area. Bulgaria is a bit more reluctant, but I think would support selectively some of the initiatives that I'll allude to later. Turkey, on the other hand, has been remains in the mindset that it can still manage Black Sea security with Moscow because of its special relationship. And because of the difficult situation it finds itself vis-a-vis the situation in Syria and now in Libya, it's very fearful of damaging relations with Russia at this precarious time. And so it's been very cautious. So let's turn to the partners, the three on the western shore of the Black Sea I'm sorry, the two on the western side and three on the eastern side of the Black Sea. So starting with the western side with Ukraine and Georgia. Ukraine and Georgia, of course, I'm not talking about the sides, but let's start with them in terms of their level of commitment. Ukraine and Georgia are committed to Western integration. They support deeper defense cooperation with the US and other allies. And of course, there have been considerable training programs, particularly the US government, in assisting in the development of their national defense capabilities. Moldova, staying on the western side, again, for now, I'm turning back there, has a divided government and citizenry. It's contributed to Western exercises and welcomes support on military reforms. However, under President Dodon and the government that came to power at the end of last year, structural reforms have been halted, and the pro-Moldova policy that Dodon had suggested was more balancing has taken a more pro-Russian orientation. Looking then back to the eastern side, Armenia, of course, is in a difficult spot. It's dependent on Russian security patronage, but it remains open to diplomatic and limited security cooperation with the West and particularly with the United States. Azerbaijan has pursued a practical and measured relations with Russia, but it can play an important role, I think, in regional security, particularly in reducing Europe's reliance on Russian energy. So we came to the conclusion that US and NATO engagement needs to weigh these asymmetry of interests and different military capabilities, risk tolerance, but also Russian red lines before charging off in the development of a new strategy. But with that said, we have tried to outline some elements that we think could form the core of a more robust and effective Western strategy, for lack of a better term, towards the region, but one that would certainly engage all these allies and partners in perhaps a variable geometry kind of format, given the differences we noted. First of all, we thought it's important to respond to Russian influence measures proactively, but selectively, because there's so much of it out there. When we looked into the details, and some of my colleagues who are expert on this, we found there's so much of this that it's hard. You don't want to be scattershot, and in any event, it may not have the desired effect. So, but selective and proactive response can be effective. But really, the key thing is to highlight the benefits of Western integration to countries in the region that are facing these kinds of interference, which is very much a focus of some of the Russian activities. But we do need, we think, to focus a bit more on the hybrid threats to regional security. And this remains a priority of some of the governments, as I alluded, even as we also look at the more hard military kinds of questions. So on the question of a deterrent posture, a more effective Western and allied deterrent posture, we argue that you don't need to match Russian capabilities and the growth of some of the things that I alluded to. We can look at the sort of more flexible and tailored kinds of things, certain kinds of asymmetric responses to Russian provocations, perhaps the deployment of advanced air and coastal defense systems in Romania, maybe even Bulgaria, to counter Russian missile threats, to look at expanded US and NATO naval presence and exercises, which have in fact ticked up a bit since 2014, but also further integration of existing maritime capabilities. Now that will have to be selected because, as I said, not all allies even agree on how that could proceed, but we think that there are ways to tailor this and have a bit of a variable geometry approach. It's important to retain and maintain, I argue at least, the efforts to strengthen partner resilience and defense, and backed by allied cohesion can temper Russian aggression. And I think we've seen this effect in Ukraine, certainly since 2014, and also in Georgia, even going back since 2008. I think it's important to maintain the bilateral security dialogue and defense cooperation with Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Moldova within each country's comfort zone, because just to keep the doors open and the dialogue going, and to allow for a kind of a continuing perspective, particularly among those in those countries who are interested in at least limited Western integration, to understand those benefits. One starting point we noted for improved regional cooperation might be these ad hoc kind of bilateral or partnerships on mutual priorities that would attempt to think about cooperation flexibly and creatively. You could have opt-ins and opt-outs, potential spoilers, countries that don't want to play, but maybe some in the region might. And we've seen elements of this, and we can talk about that in the discussion in past practice. And lastly, we noted there are some other existing mechanisms, some of which have fallen away by the Black Sea cooperation and some other that have not been very effective in recent times. But there is one mechanism, the Southeast European Defense Ministerial, which doesn't include everyone along the littoral, but most of them. It was established in the late 90s with the United States lead and support of countries in Southeastern Europe, but very much with the goal of trying to enhance regional cooperation and reach across the Black Sea to partners on the eastern side. And so it might be that this could be utilized, it's still going, and it could be utilized more effectively for regional initiatives. And it might even include consultations from other officials beyond defense ministries who are involved in broader regional security concerns. So let me stop there, and I look forward to hearing Dr. Young's comments and the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for this overview of the challenges that we face, and on the other side, what each of the countries are putting forth in tackling these challenges and what their comfort zone is. And before we go into them more deeper, I'd like to ask Tom if he can give us an overview of the Allied capability, NATO capability shortcomings in the Black Sea region.
I would be delighted to do so, and greetings to everybody from Monterey, California. I'm delighted to be invited by the Frontier Europe program of the Middle East Institute to join you today. Thank you very much. First, I have to give you a disclaimer. I'm at the Naval Postgraduate School, but I work for the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. My institution is called the Institute for Security Governance. And so I have to make the disclaimer that everything I say is my own personal views, and they do not in any way reflect US government policy at any level. So let me hit 3 points. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I don't know if I'll be as good as Steve, but I'll try to be as good as Steve. But let me be very brief by looking at, number one, what are Allied shortcomings or shortfalls in the Black Sea region? I'm going to follow with just a brief assessment of readiness of forces and defense institutions in the region. And then I'm going to look at the challenges of modernization. So I'm going to hit 4 major issues, what I determine to be capability shortfalls in the region. Number one, I think the biggest one that we're facing, and I would like to compliment my government and the administration for responding to this well, is trying to fix maritime domain awareness, and trying to create a much better recognizable radar picture in the Black Sea. That's number one. Number 2 would be air surveillance radar networks still need to be modernized and quite frankly expanded. And this would be not only over sovereign territory on land, but also the Black Sea as much as possible. Number 3, command structure. I have an issue with both the Allied vision of command structure in the region in crisis and war. I'm not really convinced we're there yet. I just wrote a piece that Yulia has read that I have out at a journal now, where I'm critiquing the government decision in Romania to create this multinational corps. I think it's going to be in Sibiu or in Brașov. And I think, this is going to take needed resources away from the multinational division. So this puts me at maybe a bit of a disagreement with Ben Hodges and his excellent work. But the issue I have is that there are not enough enablers to make these war fighting headquarters. And it's just not in the Black Sea, but we can look at Central Europe as well. The enablers are not there. The 4th point is, with the exception of Romania and of course Greece and Turkey, the armies in the region are still very much brigade level. The divisional level and the concept how to fight at the division at that level conceptually isn't there. And again, they don't have the enablers. That's the first point. Second point on readiness, very briefly. I wrote a piece on readiness of Allied forces in the region that was published a year ago this month in June in the Rusi Journal. I recommend you to that if your viewers, participants are interested in it. But number one, with the exception of Turkey and Allied partner for peace armed forces, habitually they do not conduct collective training. Navies do not probably get about half the number of days at sea per year that they need. And In some cases, it's even less. Air forces are still very much reliant on Soviet-Russian aircraft, which ties them to, not in the case of Romania, but at least in Bulgaria and Slovakia, ties them back to RSK MiG in Moscow. And even then, they're still not getting the flying hours they need, particularly with the new, with the onset of the F-16s, like say in Romania. At the level of defense institutions, I would say the common weaknesses or pathologies is an inability to produce, let alone implement, viable defense plans, that is to say, defense plans that are costed. Human resource management practices and assumptions are still very much conceptually based on conscription and not on professionalization. You can see this, for example, in the NCO Corps, how underdeveloped it is in these countries. A lack of a sharp operational focus of the armed forces. This gets back to the fact you don't do the exercises that they desperately need. And the inability to change. And I marvel at the Ukrainian general staff, and I don't want to pick on them because other general staffs have similar challenges, but I marvel that you can be at war and the general staff still operates the way that it has, let's say prior to 2014. Apropos, if we look at Romania and Bulgaria, I see policy incoherence, which produces capability incoherence. You buy the aircraft, but you don't fund the Air Force enough, for example, to have a sufficient number of pilots with all the certifications so you can actually utilize the capability. Slow to adopt modern planning and management practices. You have unbalanced defense budgets. Budgets should be, between amongst operations and maintenance, infrastructure and personnel. These should be approximately in thirds, equal thirds, and none of these countries get close to it. And then finally, very briefly on modernization, Bulgaria and Romania missed out on modernization efforts in the 90s and the aughts. And so they're playing very much a catch-up game with, now we have COVID-19. I think we are going to see big hits in both the modernization budgets as well as in the operations and maintenance. Or my biggest fear is they'll go ahead and buy the equipment, but they won't continue the operations and maintenance. So you'll have the equipment, but you won't be able to use it. So I'm going to leave it there, and I welcome any questions or debate.
Just to follow up on that, Tom, briefly, we also discuss a lot in our domain of Black Sea security, the problem of readiness. To what extent each of the NATO member states and NATO partners that have increased security challenges in the region, like Ukraine and Georgia, but also NATO members like Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, to what extent are they, in your evaluation, ready, and where are the major problems that they need to address in increasing their readiness in the event of attacks or aggressions?
I'm going to hit three very quick points. And number one is you could triple the defense budgets in those two countries if you wanted it, and we'll leave it to those two countries. I'm not going to talk about Turkey because I just don't have the expertise, or I'm going to defer to Steve on particularly the Turkish armed forces. But there are three things that desperately need to be done, and I've published this before, but I'll say it again. Number one, you have to empower commanders. Commanders are systematically denied the ability to grow into being real commanders throughout Central and Eastern Europe. It is a common pathology that's the result of culture, the result of the legacy of communism, result of just bad civilian oversight, for example. And then human resource management is huge in that there are very few of these countries have a shortage of very good people, but the system is incapable of using them properly, in my personal opinion. The argument I made in Bucharest back in October at a conference I attended was, unleash your human potential. A lot of your problems can be solved by just using the assets you currently have. And then the third point is there's very little understanding, and here I'm going to critique the ministries of defense and dare I say ministries of finance. There's very little appreciation of the fact that if you don't have a 30-year budget dedicated to what we'll call training, maintenance, and operation, you have just wasted the rest of the defense budget. And it cannot be conceptualized as it is throughout the region as, oh, we're going on a mission, so we will train the forces, do all the individual training and the collective training, so now they can do the mission readiness training. No, it's ridiculous to do that, because you never get better. You go, you do the mission, you come back, and you go back to low readiness. You know, some units have to be at high readiness. You'll never have enough money or people, you know, to everybody to be at high readiness. But there needs to be a better appreciation of the fact that you have to pay for it. And that may result in an analysis of the defense institutions that they're too big to start off with, because none of them were really costed fully after the end of communism. And quite frankly, all of them are a little bit too big for their budget. In some cases a little, in some cases a lot.
Thank you, Tom, for that. And as we go into the countries, I'd like to turn to Steve. We already have a bunch of questions from our participants on Turkey specifically. One is whether you believe, Steve, that the US may still rely on Turkey as its key tool to decrease Russian influence in the South Caucasus specifically. The other one is regarding the Montreux Convention and Turkey and Russia pursuing similar policies to extend that agreement. But the question is, but Ukraine and other shore states object to the current situation. Do you think that Turkey and Russia would work together to keep NATO and the West out of the Black Sea?
Thanks. I'm happy to address those. Let me start with the second one first, though. So on the Montreux Convention, which is it's too complicated to go into here, but it does place certain tonnage restrictions and size restrictions on vessels that can transit through the straits into between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, or through the Dardanelles. There has been some discussion in Turkey, particularly with the discussion of this new canal that is one of President Erdogan's great projects, a second canal, whether or not the so-called Istanbul Canal, whether that could be, whether the Montreux Convention would still apply to that, or that could be some other way to circumvent it. But so there has been some speculation about whether Turkey and Russia might cut some kind of a deal on this. I think that it seems unlikely to me. The Russians certainly would like to put pressure on Turkey to look at rolling back some of those restrictions. But there's other littoral states, parties, riparian states that are involved. So it's not something that Turkey and Russia can sort of quickly decide among themselves. But there is certainly some concern now with regard to reliance on Turkey and Turkey's role. Turkey, as I suggested, has long had the view that somehow its special relationship, and particularly since President Erdogan came to power in 2003, this idea that Turkey could, by maintaining and developing a strategic cooperation with Russia, it could play a role as both living up to NATO commitments, but also supporting and advancing some kind of a rapprochement and practical cooperation. Over the past few years, of course, after there have been various ups and downs in the relationship. Historically, it's not been one of great friendship, but after a big breach in 2015, the relationship has taken another uptick towards this idea of building this greater strategic cooperation. There have even been some combined naval activities. And of course, they are cooperating or have been cooperating in the so-called Astana process with regard to Syria, and even coordinating military operations in northern Syria, not without some very serious problems, including the deaths of a number of Turkish soldiers recently. So I think the Turkey-Russia relationship is still a fraught one. Yes, it's somewhat of a partnership, but it's a very wary one, and one subject to further disruptions. And I think even earlier this year, when we had the killing of these at least 13 or so Turkish soldiers in a Russian bombing mission in support of Syrian forces in Idlib province, that was another reminder of how this could come to some kind of a breach. Nonetheless, I do think that, as I said, Turkey's trying to play this balancing act, that it can somehow maintain a close relationship with Russia and still be a loyal NATO ally. And when Turkey gets into trouble, as even in this last instance with regard to in Idlib, there was even some discussion about, well, what can we have to go to NATO to look for help? To, you know, what if the Russians widen the attacks or turn on us? So it's a very conflicted policy. I do think that there's some question as to how Turkey would behave in various scenarios, but I think by and large, the Turkish government remains wary of Russia's capabilities. They know that particularly with the improvements that have been made in the military buildup on Crimea and other developments in the force modernization, that they are not quite as effective a force in countering Russia alone, and that they will need some support if it comes to an open conflict. But that's, of course, their great nightmare. They want to avoid that.
And then another follow-up on Turkey, more of a political question we have is that given the newfound expansionism of Turkey and the fact that it is in NATO and the EU to defend itself militarily, do you think it makes sense to now court Turkey for EU membership to secure the eastern EU border? I find this an interesting question in the context of the discussions of the status of Turkey's membership within NATO, with big discussions around the tensions between Turkey and the United States. And on a European level, there's a lot of opposition within NATO EU core states to Turkey's membership traditionally. How do you see that in the current context?
Sure. Let me come to that. Before I do, I forgot. I did want to mention that in the second part of that first question about Turkey's role in the Caucasus and also interestingly with vis-a-vis Ukraine, despite all I said about Turkey's courting of the special relationship with Russia, as a government, they've remained committed to a strategic cooperation with both Georgia and Azerbaijan, and in developing energy corridors and other things, and regional cooperation on a limited basis. More interestingly, recently, they've also increased their security assistance to Ukraine. Part of this is driven by Turkish concerns with the state of the Crimean Tatars, or Turkic ethnicity, but it's also a bit of this other aspect of this balancing and the fact that they have remained stalwart supporters of, at least in principle, of not pulling back on the NATO pledge from 2008 that Georgia and Ukraine would one day become members of NATO, will one day become members of NATO. So that's an interesting feature. On the EU, of course, the EU relationship has been basically completely on hold for the last several years. The efforts between the Turks and Russians to cut some kind of a deal on a customs union linked to visa liberalization and linked to treatment of migrants and how Turkey was dealing with the migrant, very much a kind of a transactional sort of relationship that Turkey would try to do more to both host the refugees, and indeed they have done quite a bit using EU and other international funds, but certainly they've hosted over 3 million refugees for many, really going back since 2012. But Turkey has continued to sort of hold that as a bit of leverage with the idea of gaining visa liberalization and some progress on the customs union. European Parliament late last year called for full suspension of the accession talks. The Commission and the Council have not gone down that path, but the relationship remains very volatile. So, but I do think that in the long term, it's in Europe's interests and it's in the United States' interest for Turkey to have some kind of a relationship with the European Union, whether it's what was called at one time, a privileged partnership or something less than full membership, but some variation of the customs union further. I mean, Europe remains Turkey's biggest trading partner outside. I mean, as a collective, I mean, Russia is its largest single country trading partner, but as a whole, much of Turkish trade and economic development is linked more to Europe than it is to Russia. But the Russian energy dependence is enormous and remains an important lever.
Thank you, Steve. If I may turn to Tom, there's some questions on Romania and how that links to Black Sea security. We know that Romania has the pretension and is trying to implement a policy of regional stability by bringing the West in as much as possible. It's one of the closest US allies in the region. And you looked closer, you mentioned earlier your article that comes out soon on strategic planning in Romania. How do you see Romania coping with strategic adaptation in the current context of regional insecurity?
I would be interested to know what you think of that, Julia. I don't even know where to start. That is a wonderful question. Honestly, I have to ponder on that. Let me ponder. I haven't thought of it that way.
All right.
And really, a Romanian should answer that.
And so let me bang on Romania as I'm particularly interested in that. There's a question for both of you from Romania. How do you perceive Romania's external profile in the region? That's sort of something that I alluded to in the context of can we assume that Romania is in fact a medium power in its outlook, or is it rather a small state with smaller influence, that the feeling is that Romania is punching below its weight, but it can actually do more than that? So how do you see Romania acting, perhaps for Steve and Tom afterwards? How do you see Romania acting in this context of Black Sea security?
Well, I think Romania has been somewhat punching above its weight. It certainly, when it developed with the United States back in 2007, in 1997, the strategic partnership with the United States, there was a real commitment to the idea that Romania was the largest and perhaps the most capable militarily in the region, in Southeastern Europe anyway, aside from Turkey, and that it could play an important role in the region. It certainly has continued to invest in its military development, its military capabilities. It's contributed in important ways to various NATO missions, both in the region and beyond, in Afghanistan, for example. But there's no doubt that and Tom, I think, has a better handle on this on the current state of the Romanian military. There's certainly various shortfalls in capabilities that they're working on. They are certainly undertaking modernization of the Air Force, other aspects of the force, the Navy remains military. But they've been very committed to maintaining the support, working with the United States Air Force and others, and maintaining the rotational presence that the United States has had there, and working in support of the various exercises in the region. So I think Romania has been certainly a leading actor in the development of regionals, and certainly was the strongest advocate of the development of the tailored, what ended up becoming the tailored forward presence that NATO agreed to at the Warsaw Summit.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you, Steve. Tom, I don't know to what extent you are familiar. There's also been a question on the recent Romanian Black Sea strategy, or the national security strategy, rather. It's not an official document yet, so it's very new news, but it has created a wave of a bit of a scandal, in that Russia reacted to the language that Romania used in its forthcoming national security strategy, this has been in the headlines all over Romania, and to some extent Russia. So in that difficult positioning of Romania as a strategic partner of the United States, and a bigger country in the region that wants to bring more Western security to the Black Sea region with the aim of building more stability. How do you see all of that?
Let me give them a couple points on all of these. These are excellent questions, and I'm happy to field them. Steve, thanks for bailing me out on the first one, because I'm still pondering that one, but I think I can get to it with these points. Number one, is Romania punching below its weight? Well, let's be realistic. Romania remains a poor country. I think people oftentimes in the West forget that. Now, economic growth in the last few years has been very, very impressive, and it's good to see corruption, some efforts on successful efforts on anti-corruption, and foreign direct investment coming in. So I mean, it's not necessarily all a bad picture. What COVID-19 is going to do to all of this, I mean, nobody knows, but I'm not very sanguine about it. But let me get back in terms of the defense side. I believe those of us in the West who fixate on the GDP has to be 2% of GDP for defense really miss the point. You could double the budget, but you could still have the same output. So it isn't a question there's going to be a direct correlation between money and increased, let's say, capabilities. One of the things that I write about in this recent essay that's sitting at a journal now is I'm rather critical about this whole issue of policy incoherence. You buy a capability, but then you don't fund its operation, for example. Is this a result of your government structure, which is based on semi-presidentialism? I think in some cases it does, and I'm highly critical of the strategic planning process that you use in Romania because it hasn't worked, to be frank. I think sort out the policy coherence as best as you can. You'll never get it right, nobody ever does. But it's clear to me that prioritization is a huge, huge problem, simply because there's so much that's needed. But let me come to that. One of the things I don't think you've done enough of in Romania, and I don't mean you, Yulia, but all of my Romanian friends, is, like I've said before, the defense establishment has never been forced to fit the existing budget. So, how many army bases do you have? I can't recall. I have them written down in I cite them in my article. How many Air Force bases? How many naval bases? I mean, how much infrastructure do you actually need? If I look at the Navy, a lot of these legacy platforms, you're never going to put them to sea. They're not going to sea now. So one of the things that I call for in my paper is that there needs to be a campaign of ruthless cuts of capabilities and infrastructure. Maybe not even capabilities, empty units. There are things that are going on in the defense establishment that are eating money but are not producing capabilities, and that needs to be addressed as quickly as possible. And again, I'm not being anything creative here or original, but a colleague of mine in Estonia made the argument recently in terms of mid and high level air defense that, given the size of the country, given the size of the economy, we're never going to be able to get it out of our if it's paid for out of the national budget. And he's advocated, we probably have to take a national loan like we did in the 1930s. And I think this is something that you need to think very hard about in Romania, particularly your F-16 fleet. You need about 40 frames to have the ability to have a coherent force. You're halfway there. At least you're training a lot of pilots, but they're not getting 180 hours. So you need to decide where you're going to put the money, and then you have to go in full, which means you have to cut back other things. And if I were the Minister of Finance, before I signed off on a national loan in a foreign currency, one of the things I'd want to see is, okay, what are you going to cut? And then the final point, apropos the national security strategy, I saw that comment and I read it, and I have to say it's a little, I don't want to say it's funny, but it is a little ironic that the Russians would be complaining about language which actually that accurately explains their behavior. And I would say if the Russians are irritated, I would say, well, if you don't like it, then change your behavior. I'm surprised it hasn't been said before. Basta.
And then turning to Bulgaria from Romania, a question also on the defense aspect. The Bulgarian defense spending per service, a question comes in, is one of the lowest in the region, even in NATO. The same applies to the flying hours of pilots, the lowest one in NATO as well. And so considering the country's defense modernization program, how do you see the future of the country's defense capabilities if the Ministry of Defense does not address these issues?
I have great fears that those F-16 Vipers, they're going to really suck the life out of that rather meager defense budget. That's a very complex piece of machinery. I mean, the electronics are not all that dissimilar from the F-35s. It's really a system more than an airplane. And I know the Bulgarian military rather well. I know they've got some phenomenally good, technically minded people, but they're going to be stressed. And I just looked at their operations and maintenance budget. It's 10%, not 30, but part of that is simply because of the F-16 purchase. That's another force. They have to look very, very hard at these empty units and the infrastructure. You know, why do you have 4 defense universities, for example? You know, they can learn a lot from the Brits, to be frank, in terms of you just have to decide where your priorities are. We all struggle with that. I mean, I worked on the Army staff. I mean, I supported the Army staff, I should say. And, you know, it's always an argument over a priority. And is it costed? Is it not? And then where does it stack up? It never ends. But this is something that a lot of countries haven't had to face. But I think the F-16 issue is going to really present challenges to the minister and to the new chief of defense, Admiral Eftimov. I don't have an answer, but they're going to have problems.
And then another question on Bulgaria, perhaps for Steve from the U.S. Department of State, in light of increased Russian pressure in recent years on Bulgaria in political, economic, and cultural affairs, all of which has been magnified by malign foreign influence in the media. How should NATO highlight such Russian efforts as a security threat to Bulgaria, and what can NATO do to bolster Bulgaria's overall security and stability?
No, I agree. That is a real concern, and I do think that it goes to one of the points I made about working effectively with not only governments but also civil society groups that are working very effectively to try to expose and counter some of these influence measures. In particular, in Sofia, there's the center that has done the Center for the Study of Democracy, which has done a great deal of work on this, working also with CSIS here in the United States on the so-called Russia Playbook, looking at the CSD has done some really excellent work in trying to highlight these Russian influence measures. But of course, it also is the issue is also how the Bulgarian Bulgarian government is also going to respond to some of these things, which, you know, being somewhat divided between President Radev's more sort of Russia-friendly tenor and other aspects of the government, other elements of the government, which you know, so they're also in a bit of this, as I alluded to, this sort of bit of a balancing effort, recognizing both their vulnerability and dependence on Russian energy supplies and other economic economic and not so visible measures of influence that have to be taken into account when they make national policy decisions. But I think Bulgaria has shown, you know, it has continued, though, you know, at a macro level to, you know, the overall assessment is that it has remained certainly very committed to the alliance. It was hesitant at the time of the Warsaw Summit to endorse the ideas that the Romanian government was proposing in terms of the potential NATO Black Sea presence. But nonetheless, it went along with the final decision, and it has continued to support it. Of course, it supported a sizable U.S. Marine presence before that was moved to Norway, and continued to have exercises and activities and contribute to both NATO and other U.S.-led multilateral exercises in the region. So, but on the influence area, I do think that is an area that the U.S. government, certainly the State Department's Global Engagement Center, working with the Bulgarian government, with other governments in the region to look at how to respond effectively to those and to take that kind of targeted approach, because there is so much of it that's out there that, you know, some of my colleagues who are much more expert on this had come to the conclusion that you can't, it's like whack-a-mole. You can't deal with every kind of effort to try to twist some story or to create fake news, but to highlight some of the most critical ones and deal with those effectively. And then also to continue to show citizens in the region the benefits of, in the case of Bulgaria, being a member of the European Union, being integrated into the transatlantic institutions, as opposed to whatever kind of suggestions that Russia has of some kind of a new special relationship with countries in the southeastern Europe and the West Balkans.
And now that we've looked a little bit, given the time constraints, into NATO members and their strategic adaptation to the new challenges, can we look a little bit into Ukraine and Georgia as NATO partners struggling with particularly severe security challenges, as their membership is not in the cards for the moment, at least? How do you see their options, and what would you recommend, a question from our participants, exploring for them exploring deepening defense and security cooperation with NATO beyond what already exists? What options do they have? I don't know who wants to go first.
I think that's a Steve question.
Okay. All right. I will start anyway, and Tom, feel free to, I'll try not to.
Sure.
Well, you know, I think that there was a lot of anxiety at the beginning after 2014, you know, turning first to, well, let's turn first to Georgia. Back in 2008, after the Russia-Georgia war, there was the whole question of what the United States would do to help. You know, the U.S. was involved in training Georgian forces, but primarily for counterinsurgency missions and support that they were taking in Afghanistan and to some extent in Iraq. And of course, the forces that were even in those missions came back to Georgia. But nonetheless, the U.S. has continued to maintain a steady tempo, the Army in particular, but other services as well, of exercises with the Georgian Armed Forces and geared at trying to help advance their national defense capabilities to get them to be able to become and increase their interoperability to engage in NATO operations in the region. So I think all of that remains critically important, and as a way to continue to enhance their capacity both for national self-defense, but also to the extent to which and when they do choose or would choose again to support some kind of NATO mission in the region, that they would be well prepared to do that. Ukraine is another example. Of course, the U.S. has had a strong security relationship with Ukraine since the beginning, particularly in the development of the Navy, which of course was sadly lost after the seizure of Crimea, most of it anyway. But after 2014, when the U.S. began the limited training program for both the National Guard forces and then some aspects of special operations forces, shifting to and expanding to some other regular Army units, and working also with the UK and other governments that have been involved, Canada, in those training programs. I think all of those efforts have helped to enhance Ukrainian modernization. There's been even, I know that some of the American military personnel that I've talked to have said they've also learned from the Ukrainians in terms of countering Russian insurgency techniques and other things. So it's not been a one-way street, but I think all of that certainly as both an important political signal at a time when obviously there's no security commitment to Ukraine, but the fact that that NATO countries continue to train and work with, and indeed, of course, we've provided now lethal weapons with the javelins, with other overcoming that hurdle that had been blocked at the end of the Obama administration, and without any kind of great Russian pushback. Nevertheless, so I do think that there are things that could be done. I would say, and Tom could probably talk more enlightenedly about this on the maritime domain awareness. That's certainly going to be a key thing for Ukraine as it tries to build back a limited kind of really Coast Guard kind of capability, and both to maintain its rights through the Kerch Strait and in the Sea of Azov, and then also along the Black Sea coast. That I think that's an area where the United States, not just the Navy, but the Coast Guard and other Coast Guards and navies could be very helpful to the Ukrainians in enhancing that capability of their maritime security.
Tom, I think Steve briefly alluded to that. We've had news yesterday that the United States has agreed on a new batch of military aid of $60 million to Ukraine. That is welcome news, but and also that includes the maritime aspect with naval patrol boats, something that Ukraine is in urgent need of after the cutting, the high reduction of its naval capabilities after the annexation and Russian seizing of some of them. Does that make a big difference for Ukrainian security in the short and medium term? And what can be done more so to help Ukraine?
I am going to limit myself on that because I do not want to seem like I'm critiquing U.S. government policy and the efforts of my organization colleagues, to be very blunt. But I think both countries, in the case of Ukraine and in the case of Georgia, one of the things that they desperately need to do, because particularly the Ukrainian defense institution is still very, very much legacy based. I would welcome to see an effort to look at the defense institution and to question every possible assumption they have. Because the more I look at the Ukrainian armed forces, and I worked with them for 10 years, they have not really changed in many fundamental ways. If you're in the Donbass, you're in the front, you've definitely changed. You have to. But Russia has changed. Russian armed forces have changed since 2008, and I'm not necessarily sure the Ukrainians have, and I still see some legacy thinking in Georgia. So I would think we need to look very, very hard at every assumption you have going through that organization. Apropos this, the whole issue of naval defense and maritime domain awareness, I have advocated in an essay I published last year in the Naval War College Review, looking at NATO's new navies, that we need to look very, very hard at the Baltic Sea, but more importantly, the Black Sea. We need to start thinking less conventionally in terms of platforms, and we need to be thinking about effects and capabilities. And this is very, very hard for navies to include the United States Navy. So I mean, we all suffer from this problem. And I would think what I had argued was this is a perfect opportunity to start thinking very creatively and implement a program of experimentation. I mean, do you really want to put platforms in the Black Sea with the Russians having caliber missiles? I mean, you have to really ask yourself, do you really want to do that? Which is why I've critiqued this decision of your government in Romania to purchase the Go corvettes, particularly without close-in weapon systems, for example. It's about effects. And, the idea of whether it's, the extended harpoon, whether it's the Norwegian, Kronberg anti-ship missile, you need to be able to dissuade the Russian Navy from coming out. So that's ASW, that's this missile defense. It's a much better radar net. It's not necessarily old platforms. And I know that will get me in trouble with a lot of my friends in the region, and particularly my naval friends. But this is a completely different altered security environment. And we need to start experimenting with cyber, with drones, with everything new, and see how we can dissuade Russian adventurism. And I don't think a couple old ships are going to do that, or even new surface ships with the wrong kit. Pasta.
Thank you. So before, or in an attempt to wrap up this discussion that I would have loved to continue, but we have limited time, I want to come back to my initial and perhaps the hardest question. Given that all the details that we discussed in terms of readiness, strategic adaptation of both NATO as an alliance, member states, and the region of the Black Sea with its members and partners, and the help that the United States does provide as the most active regional partner of these countries, why is there still a limited interest for this region compared to other regions, despite all the problems that come with the Black Sea and are so current and we're facing? Why is there so little attention among DC policymakers where we are here, and what can be done to improve that?
I'll take the first bite at the apple very quickly. I think people have rediscovered the Baltic and have fixated on the Baltic. And for whatever reason, and we've seen this in NATO, in NATO policy, you know, we're reinforcing, you know, the Baltic area, the Central Front, so to speak, but, you know, we're only doing training in the Southeast. I mean, what's this all about? There's limited resources, I understand that. There are priorities, I get that. But I think we do that at our hazard, because I think there are plenty of opportunities. I would argue more opportunities in the Black Sea region for Russians to engage in mischief than there are in the north. And I know we're out of time, so Steve, your thoughts.
Well, I fully agree. I think that it's been a issue of resources. It's also a bit about focus of attention. But I think it is shifting. I do see signs that there is, and it's not just the United States has been, if anything, I think has been among the more forceful. Certainly, you know, if you think of General Hodges, now of course retired, but he was in his service, it was very much pointing in that direction, and his active duty service, and now continuing to write very important works on that, on the importance of the region and why we should be taking further steps to address those problems. So, but I do think there is a recognition. I think we're just one more flashpoint. We need another. You know, some people thought after the Kerch Strait incident that there might be some renewed attention. There was sort of a bit of a blip. But then, of course, you had the whole flap and all the disagreements over the Ukraine security assistance package and that. So there was a bit of a disruptive effect in the movement of the Marines from Bulgaria to northern Norway. So I think that it's been a back and forth, but overall, I think NATO, among some of the other allies, they are recognizing the importance of the region more, and we may just see it may take a sort of a catalyzing incident, sadly, but I do think it's something that the alliance ignores at its peril.
Thank you, the two of you, so much for taking all these questions and trying to answer them, no matter how difficult they were. Thank you to all our participants for your very interesting and challenging questions. We've tried to answer as many as we could. We're running out of time. I wanted to thank our panelists again for taking the time to address these issues and to discuss here with the Middle East Institute Black Sea security. For everyone else, please tune in for our future events. We have on July 2nd, the ambassadors of Georgia, Romania, and Ukraine talking about U.S. strategic partnerships in the region, and other exciting events on the same topics coming up. Thank you again, Steve Flanagan and Tom Young, for your participation and your inputs. And everyone, enjoy the rest of your day or evening, no matter where you are. Thank you.
Thank you.